Good morning everyone, thank you so much for joining today. So we are painting a landscape today. Not this one, this was one from 2 weeks ago, but we're going to work in a similar style. So I thought it'd be worth having a quick look at it to sort of know what we're going to work towards. Just for good order, my name is Irene, I'm an illustrator from the Netherlands and we are going to paint in watercolors today. And my plan is to use my gouache. So you have watercolor and gouache, and it's very similar. You can use them interchangeable. Gouache comes in little tubes, such as these. Watercolor also comes in tubes sometimes, and also sometimes in dried pens. I'm going to use gouache, and the benefit of gouache is that you can layer it a little bit thicker. It's a bit more opaque, and you can layer the colors a little bit better. You can join in with this class whether you're using watercolors or gouache, it doesn't matter. Just so use what you have to your availability. But know that I'm going to layer my colors a little bit thicker, like I did in the style of this picture 2 weeks ago. You can see that some of the colors are really deep and really dark, and the reason for that is that I'm using gouache. So if you're using more traditional watercolors, your painting might end up just a little bit lighter, a little bit more translucent and a little bit softer. So that said, we are going to make a really basic sketch. I did not prepare a sketch because I did not want to go too much into the sketching today, but if you want, with a sketch pencil you can sort of make a little bit of a line for this stone wall on the side, maybe a little bit of a line for where the path is. Don't worry about the person yet, we will paint that in later. I wouldn't put that in my sketch yet. And maybe a line here in the background for where you can see the mountains shine through the trees. So I will make mine a little bit darker. I already put a fine line in, so maybe sort of roughly here is where the trees in the background are. This is roughly where the road is going to be. And then this sort of wall with that moss at the top is sort of roughly going to be here. And that's as much of a sketch as I'm going to make today. So what we're going to do is first color block these different areas out. And then once that has dried a little bit, we're going to add some more detail to our picture. So that's why I keep the sketch really basic, really simple. We're just going to apply some base colors to this picture first. And then from there on we're going to add detail. So don't worry too much about all these individual trees and all these little leaves and the shadows, all these things. We will get to that later. So we'll start as simple as possible and slowly build it up from there. So you can see I'm working a little bit smaller than I sometimes do because I want to be able to finish the drawing and add a sort of reasonable amount of details in there. So I'm working a little bit smaller, but we'll see how I'm getting on. Sometimes I like to work a little bit bigger, sometimes a bit smaller, depending a bit on the picture that I'm choosing. So whether you are using gouache or watercolor paints, we need to mix up some paints on a palette just to come to the colors that we're looking for. And for the background, for the sky, even the sky behind the trees, we're going to make that whole area light blue, maybe let a little bit of white shine through for the clouds. We're going to make that whole area here blue. And we're going to use that golden brown yellow color. See if you have something that really has that warm autumn, golden sort of autumn colors. So maybe some yellow, put a little bit of orange in there. For that entire area here, and maybe a bit of green on top here, and then the rest maybe a bit of brown or grey. So have a look in your palette to see if you can find some colors that you could use. For that grey color, we can also make the puff a little bit brown. So if you don't have grey, we can use a little bit of brown for that as well. So I'm just going to start with the blue. Having a look, I have some blue colors already on my palette, but I have some really bright blue. I think that color might work really well for the sky. It's a very sort of sunny autumn day, wherever it is. I don't know where this photo was taken. I have some darker blue as well. So I'm just going to have a look to see what blue I can use to create the sky. I just realized that I have some blue and some red mixed up on my palette. And if that happens, what I do is just take a little bit of tissue paper, make it a little bit wet, and just clean my palette a little bit. I don't clean my palette completely very often. I like to sort of use it until there's no available space anymore, and then I clean it. But if it's sort of mixed up a little bit, so you can just use a little bit of paper and wipe it off. And there's my brush. So I always have my favorite brush. This is my blue corner. I think I want it a little bit brighter. I'm going to add a little bit of this light blue to my palette here. I always have a palette where I add my paint to, and then another one that I mix on. That's not necessary, that's just the way I like to do it. So this nice bright color, a little bit lighter than the other one. So if you use watercolor paint, your paint might be a little bit more translucent than when you use gouache. Gouache is a little bit thicker, and you still want to add a little bit of water to it so it moves easily over the paper. So when you have some paint ready, I'm not going to make the paper wet today, I'm going to work fairly dry. So I'm just going to start at the corners, so maybe here. And you can see, if I zoom in, that because my paper is dry, you really quickly get a little bit of that sort of grit. My paper has a bit of texture to it. So because my paint is quite dry, you really quickly get that rough feeling. I don't want that, so once that happens, I'll just add a little bit of water to my paint, and I want it to move around over the paper quite smoothly. I don't want to have that rough feeling. I just want it to move smoothly and easily. I'm going to go all the way here to that edge. So it is a little bit too dry, just add a little bit of water. So you can just spread it out over that entire area. And if you want to leave some clouds, just leave some white of the paper free. And we're going to use the white of the paper for the white of the clouds today. Maybe there's going to be a bit of a cloud here. You can make the edges a little bit more wet, spread out the paint a little bit softer. So the more water you add, the lighter the paint is going to be. And the drier, the thicker you use your paint, the thicker the color is going to be, the more opaque. So and for the clouds, if you want, you can use a little bit of clean tissue paper and just go over those edges, create a little bit of that cloudy effect. So you can sort of dab the edges a little bit until you have a little bit of a cloud shape there. You don't have to get clouds in, but if you want to. So, there we go. And because I did not make my paper wet first, the color is a little bit more solid. So I know some of you have been painting wet on wet with me before. If you make your paper wet first, the paint blurs out and sort of goes everywhere and gives a really soft layer. Because the paper was dry, our paint is a little bit thicker, but it also dries a little bit faster. So that means that once we are ready to add those trees over there, we don't have to worry too much about them blurring out. So the wetter your paper is, the looser your painting is going to be, and the drier the paint is and the paper is, the more control we have over what we want to do. So it already starts to dry a little bit. If yours is still wet, you don't have to touch it, but by the time we get to the trees, that will be dry. So I'm going to just slowly start mixing that yellow color, which is going to be all the way on that sort of background, these little trees in the background. That entire area is going to be that yellow warm color as a base color. So you can see I already have some yellow here. Make sure you clean your brush really well, because if your brush still has some blue on it and you mix it with yellow, you will get green. Which is not the end of the world for these trees, because there's lots of green trees, but we want to see if we can capture a bit of that autumn feeling. Maybe slightly, see? That paint that I just added was a bit contaminated. My palette is a bit messy, so I might just take that off and grab some clean yellow paint. So I'll go straight on there because I think I will use quite a lot of that today. So if you have a bit of a dot of paint, always sort of get a little bit from the edges, make it wet, and you can always take off a little bit more from the edges. So instead of putting your brush in the middle of that big dot and having a big clutter, a big sort of dot of paint on the end of your brush, just take it from the edges with a little bit of water and then wipe off the excess, and then that way you have a bit of control over how much paint is on your brush. If you put your entire brush in the paint all the way till here, it's very hard to control how much paint comes out and goes onto the paper. So when you're ready, no rush, just going to color block this area. In the same way as I did that sky. So I'm just starting on the edges, spreading it out, keeping my brush quite flat. See, and if you get these marks where your paint is really dry, just dip your paint in the water and add a little bit of water. A nice smooth application of paint. And when you use gouache like I am, your color will probably be quite intense, like mine is, quite warm and colorful and thick. If you're using dried watercolor paint, this will be a little bit more see-through. Either is absolutely fine, just the final look of your painting will be a little bit different. So I'm going to go all the way up there. So if you go over the edges a little bit, that's absolutely fine. Actually, I made an extra line here for that green area next to the road. Might add in a little bit of yellow there as well. I know that yellow and green go together really well, because yellow is one of the main colors that makes up green, so I can add a bit of yellow there as well. Go over it with green later on. So. And I find this color yellow that I've used so far a bit too bright. It has a very sort of lemony, sunflower, it's a little bit too bright. It's not quite that autumn feel that I'm looking for. I'm going to just take a little bit of red. So, just a little bit of red, mix it up with the yellow just here in the corner. Just a tiny bit. I think this is already a bit too much. Wipe off the excess. Just a little bit of red in that yellow, very, very gentle. Red is a very overpowering color, you only need a little bit. So I'm just going to go over here and add a little bit of red here and there. Just with a dipping motion of my pencil. My paint is still a bit wet, so this mixes up really nicely. A little bit of that darker yellow where I added a little bit of red in. I'm just going over that area, make it a little bit less even. I quite like it to be some darker areas and some lighter areas in there. This is just the background color. This is just the background color, and some areas are a little bit darker, some a little bit lighter, and I can sort of imagine that later on when I make these trees a bit more precise that it's helpful to have a bit of different colors already in there. So, and red and yellow work together really well. They make orange together. So they're very, they're colors that just go beautifully together. So if you mix them on the paper, like I'm doing now, it's a little bit less risky than, say, purple and yellow, for example, which are colors that are not naturally mixed very easily, because they will make it brown or grey. A bit of red and yellow, making it a little bit orange. So I'm going over that edge a little bit. That line is very straight, so I want it to be a little bit less straight. So if it mixes with the blue a little bit, it's fine. My blue has dried quite well already, so I can go over that edge, making it a little bit less even. So, I quite like that color. It feels a bit more like autumn than that really bright yellow that I started with. So, this sort of color, all these trees here on the side are also going to have that warm autumn yellow. We'll get to those later though. This is just the background for now. I'm going to start on this path now. If I go too fast, work at your own pace. There's absolutely no rush. So just work at your own pace. I'm going to mix up some color for the path, and I'm going to mix up a little bit of brown. I do have some grey, but I think that brown goes quite well because it can sort of be the color for the trees as well. I'm going to mix up some brown, and my plan is to apply it quite thickly at the foreground and then make it lighter and lighter further towards the back. And the reason for that is that you have a bit of that light shining through here. So if I already make a bit of a gradient, I think it'll be easier for me later on to make it look a little bit like the sun is shining there where the trees are not. Where the trees are not blocking the light. So I have some browns here already. If you do not have brown, which is of course a possibility, if you do not have brown, you can mix it by mixing green and orange together. Brown basically is the color that forms if you add all the colors of the color wheel together, all the primary colors. So if you have red, blue, and yellow, red, blue, and yellow, the primary colors, if you mix them all up together, you get black. But with paint, because black is a very, very dark color, with paint it usually becomes more of a brown color because all these colors are a little bit diluted, and to get pure black is very hard with paint. So it usually forms a brown color. And the easiest way of doing it yourself is by adding a bit of green and orange together, because those two colors have all the colors of the primary colors in them. So I'm going to make this area brown. You can also use grey if you have some grey color. If you have some grey color in your palette, you can also make the path grey. It's up to you. So I'm making a stripe, and then just with a little bit of water, spreading it out towards the background. And the more water I add to the paint, the lighter the color will be. So every time I dip my brush into the water, adding in a little bit more water, and that path is going to get lighter and lighter towards the background. It's almost like an abstract painting now, isn't it? Slowly we're going to make this into a landscape. So, and I have some grey ready here for the stones and the rocks. I just add that grey straight on here. If you don't have grey, you can mix it by adding some black and white together. And that is going to be mostly white with a little bit of black. Because black, again, similar as red, is a very overpowering color. You only need a tiny bit to change the color of the white to become grey. So, because that top bit is going to be grass and green, I'm only adding that grey to the bottom bit. So if it blurs out a little bit with the color of that path, that's absolutely fine. These colors are very similar, it's fine if they mix up a little bit together. So, and then the last part that I'm going to give a base color is this white area here, and I'm going to use a bit of green for that. So I have some green on my palette here. I find this a bit too dark. There's already a bit of blue on here, so maybe if I mix it. I find it a bit too bright. I want a little bit of a mossy green. So if you add a little bit of yellow to your green, it becomes a little bit more of a moss color, a bit of a mossy color. So with adding a bit of yellow, it instantly becomes a bit more of that army green, moss green. So, and I'm just going to give that area a bit of green, and I'm already going over that edge a little bit. Because the idea is that that grass is going to sort of stick out a little bit. So this doesn't have to be a perfectly smooth circle. And if it mixes up a little bit with these colors, then it's fine. Not too worried about it. So you can always add a little bit of water on the paper if your paper is a little bit too dry. So there we are. We have a little bit of a base color already. Make sure you clean your brush really well. Make sure you clean your brush really well, because all these colors, they are easily mixed up if your brush still has some green or some brown on it. So the first thing I'm going to do is just feel my paper, just to see how wet or how dry it is. If your paper is really soaking wet, so some areas like here there's still a bit of a drip there, so I can instantly see it's still quite wet. The green is really shiny, so I can see it's wet. I always just like to feel my paper, just so I know how it feels or how wet or how dry my paper is. And the drier the paper, the more precise we can be, and the wetter the paper, the looser our painting is going to be. So there's a bit of personal preference and personal style in there. Some people want to paint really loose, and some people quite like to keep control and paint a little bit more precise. So there's not a right way and a wrong way to make. You have to find your own preference and balance in how wet or how dry you like to use your paper. But just touching it really gently with your fingers is the best way of getting to know your paper. I want to start making a little bit of tree shapes here on the background. You can see that there's almost a bit of fluffiness to those trees, or there's a little bit of texture in there, and we added it in already a little bit by just adding the second layer of colors. As far as I'm concerned, my sky is finished. I'm not going to add any more to the sky, apart from making trees that go over it. If you want your sky to be a little bit brighter, feel free to add an extra layer of blue to it. But if you're happy with the color of your sky, I'm not going to add any more to mine. This is just going to be the color that that area is going to be. But for these trees here in the background, I want them to be a little bit more tree-like, if that is a thing. So I'm mixing up maybe a little bit of yellow and brown. I have some of this warm yellow here still. Maybe I'll add a tiny bit of brown to it. So I have some different colors in that one section of my palette. And then every time I dip in my brush, I can choose, do I want a little bit more yellow, do I want a bit more orange, or a bit more brown. So maybe slightly thicker. And I'm just going to use the tip of my brush to start adding some of that texture in. So a little bit of these type of shapes, a little bit of the trees. These are these how do you call them? Like pine trees. They have the really specific sort of pointy shape. I just want to go over there and create a little bit of that texture. And this is not a super precise painting, but we want to create a bit of an illusion of some things being there. So maybe a bit of green as well. It's up to you. Here's some of these trees. If you look at that photo, some of those trees have a bit of green in them, some have a little bit of yellow. So I'm using quite small motions now, just to create a bit of texture there, a bit of an illusion of some trees growing there. And because we have that base color already, we can let that base color shine through a little bit. We don't have to draw out each individual tree, but just by creating a little bit of this texture, we already create a bit of an illusion of trees or forest. This one a bit more yellow. You can use your paint slightly thicker or slightly more watery. Play around with it a little bit to see if you can create some different textures. So I like to make little dots almost. And some other people might like to use stripes to create a tree. So you could use like sort of a bit like this. So I mean, you can make slightly sort of stripy trees or use dots. Play around with it a little bit to see what you prefer. And also it depends a bit on the type of brush that you have as well. If you have a brush with a fine tip, you can make trees a little bit more precise than if you have quite a wide brush. Sometimes we are limited a little bit by the materials that we have, and that's absolutely fine. But it's good to be aware of it. So, and over this area here in the corner, I'm going to have these trees here with these branches. So I don't worry too much about this because I know I'm going to paint all these trees over here. And the same on this side, I know that that area is going to be covered with these long stems. So it's mostly this part here in the middle where we can see the little trees. So you can carry on a little bit further, but know that you'll likely paint over it for those stems. So it's mostly that little area here in the middle. If you have too much paint on your brush, don't forget to wipe it off. So, a little bit more brown here. So here I'm just adding a few more dots that I know I will paint over there with those larger trees in a moment. Maybe here as well. going to let this dry a little bit, and if I want to add a little bit more detail after it's dry, I can do so. So I like to give each layer some time to dry. It's the same. You have some of these trees and you're not 100% happy with it. Sometimes it's easier to let it dry and then go over it once it's dry with a slightly more intense color than to try and tinker and keep changing it, because the more water you add, the more loose your painting is going to be. So sometimes it's best to just let it be for a moment, and then we can always come back to it a little bit later. I might actually swap to a slightly smaller brush. I have smaller brushes, so I might as well use them. So, how's everyone getting on? I can see a lot of concentration on everyone's faces. It's really nice to see. Good. So, I want to make this side of the road a little bit more grass-like. So I'm going to use the same technique, I think, for this. You call it a hard shoulder, right? Although I don't know if you call it the same in a small road like this, but that grassy area next to the road, I want to start adding a bit of grass there, or moss or something like that, and same here on that area. And I also realized that I made this path sort of go all the way to the edge, but actually if I look at the photo, there's a bit of a grassy area sort of here that I now made into road, but actually, you see what I mean? There's a little bit of a little field or a bit of grass there. That road does not go all the way to the edge of this mountain. There's a bit of a grassy area there in the background as well. So I'm going to start adding a bit of grass there. And I had some green here on my palette already, but I want some slightly thicker, slightly more opaque color. So maybe a little bit more yellow in it. I'm just mixing up my color until I'm happy with it. So you can see I took some yellow from there that instantly contaminated the yellow, so I need to be a bit careful. I'm not very tidy with these sort of things. If you want to keep your yellow clean, you need to clean your brush first, but I don't really mind it, so I just take a bit from the other side and then I can mix that up with my green to make a slightly different color green. So, again, wipe off the excess, and I'm just going to start adding a little bit of moss here around that edge. And again, you can create this as little stripes. Make sure your brush is a little bit wet. You can make like little grassy stripes. Or if you want it to look a little bit more like moss, you can create these little dots, very similar to what we did there. It's going to be different colors. So play around with it a little bit, see if you can create something. I think sometimes having your brush quite dry can give also an interesting texture. So if you somewhat like dry brushing sometimes, here if I can show you, where you can sort of see the texture of the paper shine through a little bit, which I don't do a lot, but sometimes it can be quite a nice effect. Again, we're just playing around with it, maybe here. Adding in a little bit more yellow. If you added gouache to a palette and it starts to dry out, you can always, just with a wet brush, make sure your brush is clean, just add a little bit of water to your paint. You don't want your paint to dry out too much. It depends a bit on where you are in the world, how warm it is, how humid it is, but sometimes your paint dries out faster than other times. You can always add a little bit of water to it. I tend to keep my gouache in a palette like this. This was a really cheap one, but I like to sort of add lots of color to it, and then I keep using it, and I just add a little bit of water to it every time I want to use it. I'll change the shape here a little bit. And again, when you add black to any color, be very careful because black is very overpowering. I don't want it to be only black, but I want the grain to be a little bit darker for that area here. I'm just going to start adding some of these grasses. They sort of go over the edge a little bit. And again, just touching the paper, see if it starts to dry, especially this yellow area here. I think we're sort of ready to start adding a few of these trees. Then add a bit of a rocky texture to this area, some shadows, and then slowly everything starts to come together already a little bit. I think as soon as we have trees, it feels a little bit more like a landscape, so let's do that. If you just look at that photo, you can see that some of the trees are quite thick and some of the trees are quite thin. And even though they are all sort of growing in the same direction, they're all growing up, some are a little bit on an angle or a little bit wonky, or they're not all just perfectly straight stripes next to each other, right? Some are a little bit curved, and even if you just look at the stems that are going up and don't worry about all the branches and stuff yet, you can see that there's sort of a few different shapes going up. And I always find that it helps a little bit just to spend a little bit of time looking before I sort of commit to putting something on the paper. So if I'm just thinking, like there's a few sort of larger ones here, they all start from behind that grass, just on that edge. And then they go all the way off the paper at the top. So let's mix a bit of brown. And the color brown of these tree stems is quite dark. Actually, do I have enough here? Yeah, I still have some brown. I still had some brown that I could use. Otherwise I would take a little bit from my palette. So. Otherwise I would take a bit from, add some new one with for my tube. So again, just checking if this is drying. And I'm using quite a large brush now, so I'm swap back to my bigger brush. I'm doing these bigger trees first. And as soon as I make that line, I need to commit to it. So it's not like, oh, you do a little bit and then a little bit more. As soon as you know that there's going to be one here, just put your brush down, a little bit of pressure. So, and then all the way to the top. You can see my paint was a little bit watery. I like this to be a slightly more opaque, darker color. But for the first one, I'm quite happy with that. I can make it darker in a bit. And you can see that because I used the pressure of my brush, that line is not perfectly straight. I'm on purpose trying to make it a little bit wonky. Let me make another one. I'm going to add a tiny bit more paint to this. So a little bit less water, a little bit more paint. I'm leaving a little bit of space. I'm going to make another one here. So all the way off the edge. So, and once you have that with the tip of your brush, you can tidy it up a little bit. So, actually this one as well. I'm just going over that edge, tidy it up a little bit. You want to make sure that your background is quite dry, because otherwise the brown is going to mix up with all that yellow, and we want to keep it at least separate enough to know that these are trees. So I'm just going to carry on just for this area here. Maybe there's one here going from slightly thinner. If you put a little bit less pressure on your pencil, on your brush, the tree is going to be a little bit thinner. Or use a smaller brush. So there's going to be another one there. There's a little bit on angle. And I'm not going to count out how many trees there are in that photo. I'm just going to use that photo as an example, and then once I'm happy, I'm just going to stop. So yeah, it's up to you if you do 4, 5, 6, 10 trees. It's completely up to you. Just stop when you feel it's ready. And we're going to add the branches a little bit later. Maybe there's going to be one a little bit further out here. So and I'm going to just let these dry a little bit for a moment. So a quick look, I think this one could be a little bit darker. I'm just making them a little bit darker, and then I'm going to let them dry for a moment. You can see I've used different colors brown, because I had different colors brown. I've sort of mixed them up here next to each other. So sometimes I dip my brush into a slightly lighter brown, sometimes a bit darker. I added a little bit of black to that brown, which is what made it darker. But in the photo they're all quite uniform. They all seem to have roughly the same color. So it's up to you. You can swap it around a little bit, change the colors up a little bit, or keep them all very similar. So for a sip of tea or sip of water. So you're slowly carrying on, doing the same on this side. And actually you can just see there's a tiny bit of grey. The road is sort of winding, so we can just see a little bit of grey just here around the corner. And I quite like the idea of knowing that that path goes sort of around the bend here, and that there's a little bit of path just here around the corner. So I might add that in first. And that's the beauty of gouache. If you have watercolor, this might be a little bit harder. But with gouache, you can go over other colors that you've created before. And because it's quite opaque, you can see I can just add in a little bit of extra green there. And so I can make this a little bit more grey as well. The colors sort of match. This is a bit of an extra, you don't have to do that. You can see that with gouache you can go over a different color, and because the paint is so opaque, you can just cover something up almost completely. And just add in something that you have left out so that you want to add in later. And with watercolor paint you'll likely see a bit of that yellow shining through. You can try it, but it's up to you. I'll do a bit of green around here in a moment. So back to the trees, I added a bit of grey there for the road. And I'm just going to add some trees on that side of the picture. So I'm using a slightly smaller brush because the trees that are a bit further away from us, they instantly look thinner. And they also seem to almost, the top of the tree seems to be almost the top of the paper, right? They are getting very thin towards the top. So I'm going to, maybe there's one here. Use my brown paint, lift my brush and just make it really thin towards the top. Similar to the ones at the front, but just a little bit thinner and a little bit, but they're a bit further away from where we are. So there's going to be another one here. Slightly thinner brush. So I'm editing that path here. I'll add some grass around there in a moment. So there's going to be another one here. It looks like there's one here that might be a little bit either thicker or closer to us. A little bit of paint there stuck. So I think I'll add one more and then I'm going to add some branches and leaves. So I think that is as much as I'm going to do for now. So depending on how quickly your paper is drying, you can either start adding a bit of texture to these rocks or start adding branches to the trees. If this whole area is really wet, wait for a little bit and work a little bit on these rocks and let that dry. I always like to sort of jump around a little bit to give everything time to dry. For the rocks, I'm going to use a darker color. I have a bit of grey here, adding a bit of black to it. I want it to be quite a bit darker than the color I used. You can see I made it, it's quite a bit darker than this color. And if you've never drawn rocks before, this might be a little bit strange, but it is actually much easier than you think, because what we're going to do is just create these lines that separate one stone from the other. And because rocks have really sort of natural shapes, these lines are often a little bit crooked, a little bit thicker in places, a little bit thinner in other places. You can sort of use your imagination, just go over that area and start almost building a little wall by using these rocks. I'm sort of trying to keep them uneven. I don't want to have like, this is not a brick wall with all even stones. I want this to feel really natural, so I'm going to just use my imagination. Maybe there's some small ones here. Generally, if these are all sort of roughly the same size, then the ones that are closest to us would be the biggest, and the ones that are really far away from us would be smaller. But this is quite a small part of this rock, so we don't have to worry too much about it. And I am going to blur out those lines a little bit with some water, just to apply a bit of shadow. So these lines, they don't have to be perfectly straight. We can go over them with a little bit of water. Apply a bit of shadow here and there. I know that there's a lot of shadow cast from those trees. We'll add that in later. So maybe some of these gaps are a bit darker. So I'm just going to let that dry for a moment. Back to these trees, there's lots and lots of little branches coming off from the side, and they all seem to be quite horizontal, right? Some of them are a little bit upwards, most of them are quite horizontal. So I'm just going to use my small brush, just checking if this is quite dry, and it is. So I'm using quite thick brown paint, not too watery, so I want these to be fairly fine lines. So just going over there and start adding some branches in. You can see people, myself included, we often have the sort of feel that things should be even. So you can see, if I don't pay attention, I quite instantly make these gaps all really even, and that's something that we like as humans. But in nature, things are not often that way. So maybe there's some longer ones or some shorter ones. Try to purposefully make these branches a little bit uneven. So there's not many things that are perfectly straight or perfectly even, square. These are all like human shapes. So I know my hands are blocking my picture a little bit, so I'm just going around those trees, adding lots of little branches. And I started really carefully, but now I get the hang of it a little bit. I'm going a little bit faster. That's the thing. I usually start really carefully, and then after a while I think, oh, actually I can speed this up a little bit. So you can see I'm using a really fine brush, really quite a thin tip, not too much water. And I find that if you make your strokes quite fast, they sort of naturally end in a little bit of a point, if that makes sense. I can zoom in a little bit. I always find that if I do this quite fast, that my lines sort of naturally end in a bit of a point. If I do this really slowly, my lines tend to be a bit more rounded at the end. I don't know if you've noticed the same. Maybe here at the top some of the branches are a little bit longer. They do have leaves, but all quite high up. These trees, they don't have sort of consistent amount of leaves all the way along their stem. They all have to have clusters of leaves at the top. So I'll add the leaves in later. Just slowly building it up. And I'm making some of the branches here a little bit longer, knowing that there's going to be leaves around them. And if you find that it basically makes your tree look a little bit like a zebra, these lines are sort of going over the tree a little bit, just make them a little bit darker again. There's no once you have added some of the leaves, you can just go over the bark and blend in that with the bark a little bit again. So this one as well, be a little bit darker. So, this area here behind the trees has a little bit more darker colors and a little bit of green. Just with a small brush. So knowing I'm working on that area. Mixing up a little bit of green and brown. I'm just filling this in a little bit. I want that whole area to be a little bit, not spookier, but just a little bit fuller. A little bit darker. So just with creating little dots, filling it in a little bit. And as I said, I'm working on quite a small paper today because we're doing quite a lot of detail and I wanted to give myself the time to finish it. If you're working on an A4 or an A3 bit of paper, it's quite likely that it just takes you a bit longer to finish your drawing. So don't be rushed. It's quite possible that the size of your paper affects how fast your painting is coming together. And just take your time. There's no rush. So, I think it's time to start adding some leaves to my trees. So, the leaves in these trees that are the foreground, they are very dark brown. And the leaves here in the trees in the background are very golden yellow, warm brown. And the leaves from the trees at the foreground, the dark leaves, they are going over the light leaves a little bit. So I'm going to do these yellow leaves first. And then do the dark leaves so they can overlap a little bit, they can go over there. So I want to mix up a bit of orange and yellow again. Very similar to the background, but I think a little bit thicker and a little bit warmer as well. So a bit of orange, a bit of yellow. can mix up a little bit of brown in there if you want. So these are the colors I'm going to use. Yellow, a little bit of brown mixed with yellow and orange, and a bit of red. And I'm going to use my paint quite a bit thicker. Because I want to cover that area almost completely. So let's say I'm starting with yellow. I'm just going to create little dots. Get rid of my red on my pencil. Starting with little dots of leaves. I'm looking at that picture a little bit just for inspiration. So you can see my paint is quite thick in comparison to what I've used before. Maybe a bit of brown in there as well. Lighter yellow. I'm just playing around with the colors. And you can see in the photo these colors mix up a bit with what's in the background as well. So if these colors are a little bit similar to the colors in the background, that is fine because that's the way this picture looks. Now I'm going over these stems here and there, and behind there in other areas. Some of these branches are a bit more in the front, some are a little bit more in the background. And even though you use the same color for quite a lot of these of this area, don't forget to clean your brush once in a while, because if your paint dries up on your brush, it can damage your brush a little bit. So even if you're using the same color for a long time, just once in a while clean your brush and wipe it off, and then you can start with a clean brush again. I want a little bit of that light yellow. I have some really light, like a lemon color yellow. I've not really used it yet. I think I can add some in these trees. Some of the colors are a little bit lighter. And remember, you can mix any color that you have with white. And the white makes it a little bit more opaque as well, but also a little bit lighter. White, especially if you use gouache, tends to be a little bit chalky, and as such makes your paint a little bit more opaque. I think I'm going to let it dry, and then maybe with a really thin line add some of these branches back in. Every time we need to have a bit of patience, let things dry again. Don't rush things. You just need to have patience. Let things dry. So I think leaves makes quite a big difference. Instantly it looks like more like a forest. So just a little bit of darker colors around some edges. There we are. I'm going to just feel this orange, see if it starts to dry. There's still some areas of these leaves that are really wet, but I think where the dark leaves are going to be already starts to dry. So my paper dries quite fast because I'm using my paint quite thick today, and also I did not make my paper wet, so it all dries quite fast. If yours dries a little bit slower, just take your time. There's absolutely no rush. It's better to wait a little bit longer than to rush it when everything is still really wet. So some leaves here, and they're very, very dark and they're almost black in places. So I'm taking some black paint. I think I can use this here in the middle. Some black paint, quite a lot, not too wet. Then some green paint. Mixing that up, and I always like to mix my paint a bit unevenly. So I have some areas where I can choose to be a bit more green, and some areas where I can use really dark green, and some areas where I can use black. So I like to have the option of different colors. Then wipe off the excess, especially if you just use your brush for mixing the colors. And I'm going to start adding some leaves to these trees. So here in the corner it's very dense. So in this corner it is very dense. We can only see a little bit of the blue shine through. Some of these leaves go over the tree, some behind it. A little bit more black in there. So, maybe on the second tree here we can see a little bit more of the sky shine through. So again, I did not count out how many trees there are, but I'm sort of using that picture to inspiration. So I'm doing the same for the leaves. So they seem to almost be sort of clumping together. Maybe here there's a whole bunch of leaves, and then a little bit of nothing again. It's not like they're all together like an oak tree, where all the trees or all the leaves tend to be sort of very evenly spread around the whole crown of the tree. In these trees there seems to be, it's very uneven, isn't it? So, and again, you can play around with how wet or how dry you'd like your paint to be. So you can do a little layer with slightly more water, let it dry, and then go over it a little bit drier and more precise. So you can play around with that a little bit. slowly and steadily. So I think I'm going to let it dry for a moment. I have cleaned my brush really well, but you can see it's still a little bit stained from all that green. What I do sometimes is just clean my brushes with a little bit of shampoo. So once in a while, just really gently with a little bit of shampoo, clean them and then let them dry, and then they are a little bit as new again. Yeah, I have to do it very often, but just once in a while it's quite nice to give them a proper wash, and then they're all ready to use much longer again. So, I think I'm going to start adding some shadows in from these trees, because I find that the shadows are quite, they sort of set the mood and the tone in this picture. I'm going to add some shadows in, and then once I've done the shadows I will decide if I'm actually going to put that person in or not. So we can all decide that for ourselves, if we want that person in or if we want to leave it out. Just checking if everything is drying, and it is. So for the shadow I'm going to use a bit of black paint, but very watery. Really thin it down. So I'm going to use my larger brush for that. So I'm going to use this black paint, very watery, very thinned down, as thin as I've used any paint so far. So if you can see it on the camera, see it's very mostly water with a little bit of black paint. I'm just going to start at the base of each of these trees and really gently apply that black paint to where the shadow will be, because the shadows are all cast sort of in this direction towards us. And I do not want to rub the paper, because whatever I've painted underneath, I do not want that to mix with this dark paint. So I'm just applying it really gently. So if you're not quite ready for that yet, that is absolutely fine. But make sure that whenever you are ready to add shadows, just do it really gently. Because if you rub it, if you're rubbing it, especially here around the green or around these areas that are that you sort of spend some time painting, you don't want that all to mix up and all that detail to get lost. So this one is sort of going into this direction, a little bit thinner, really gently. These rocks also have some shadow on them. Getting really, really watery. So, and you can always do a second layer, but just let the first layer dry. You can always go over there with a second layer if you want it to be a bit more intense. Let that dry for a moment. Just zooming out for a moment, looking at a little bit of a distance. Now I can't, because I can lift my drawing and look at it from a physical distance, but I have this opportunity to zoom out and it sort of works the same. I think this rock here could be a little bit more defined. It sort of blends in with the road a little bit. So once this is dry with the shadows, I'm going to put a little bit of a line there and make it look a little bit more separated from the road. I think I can add in a few little branches here on the side. And I need to decide if I put that person in. So I think these branches I can already do. So thin brush again. So I think just from here let me go. You don't have to see those branches throughout the entire. We don't have to see that entire branch, because here and there they'll be covered with leaves a little bit. Should I draw in that person? I think I will. And I'm just going to make a silhouette. Just testing my paint. I want it to be very thick, a bit like ink, so I want to be able to draw with it quite precisely. So say the person's head is here. So I'm trying to, I know this is a little bit abstract, but so. Bit of a ghost person. Making this edge a little bit darker. And then I am going to say I'm finished for today. So,